All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a discussion of my first book, The Way of Edan. And I'm going to be sitting down here with my nemesis and developmental editor, Dr. AP Canavan, to discuss the tone and the style and world building and why I made certain choices in terms of the style and what I'm hoping that achieves. I don't know. It'll be interesting to discuss with you what you think it actually seems like. I'll have to ask you your impressions of the style of The Way of Edan, I suppose. But speaking of style, yes, you look great today, AP.
You're only saying that because you quite like this jacket.
I do. I have some tweed envy, I have to admit. Yeah.
Hello, Philip. It is good to see you.
Likewise. So I think it's going to be fun to chat a bit about what I've tried to do in the Way of Edan and the trilogy as a whole, the Edan Trilogy. And I have not made a secret of the fact that I have been inspired. I might have mentioned Beowulf a few times on the internet,
Where's
once or
my
twice.
bingo card? I definitely had Beowulf on my bingo.
So Beowulf is kind of important to me, and in Old Norse sagas and all that sort of thing as well. So those are definitely part of my DNA, and that probably has a lot to do with me reading Tolkien as a young person, and somehow coming away from that with the impression that to be a fantasy writer, I had to learn a bunch of archaic languages. So I took the scenic route to become a fantasy writer, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, it's the whole, oh yeah, I have to become a professor first, and then I can become a
Right.
fantasy author because that's how Tolkien did it. That's the only way to do it.
And don't forget the tweed. Right. Right. Invest in a lot of tweed as well. So yeah, so I'm definitely reaching toward some of those influences in my writing, at least, and you will find verse. Not that it's all over the place, but occasionally I do indulge in a little bit of verse. I have a bard type character, which I call a shaper in there, who does break into song, which is quite reminiscent of Old English poetry. So that is a part of it as well. But yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
but I was about to say, don't they always say to authors, right? What you know.
Yes, I've heard that advice. I have heard that advice. Yeah.
And obviously, you know a lot about being a traveling troubadour. Um, and but I think what you did is a perfect example of that. It's taking an element of your background, of your training, of your experience, translating it and using that as inspiration and a source of inspiration and color
Yeah.
to propel the narrative, to give it shape, to give it direction, to give it texture. That it's not about, oh, I'm a college professor, therefore I will write about being a college professor. It's about thinking about a lot of the experiences in the abstract and drawing generalities from them or trends from them or
Yeah.
oh, I went on that field trip. If I change elements of it, what did I feel during that? Can I use those things in text?
Right.
um
Also, theme, I would say, is something that I draw from Old English poetry, where exile is a very common theme. So, for an ancient people, the concept of exile was something that was worse than death, because what's taken away from you, you're not only just booted out of your tribe or your culture, but your very identity is wrapped up with that group of people. And if you're forced away from it, or if they're taken from you by death or disease or war or whatever it might be, that separation is something worse than death, because it takes away your very self from you. It takes away all meaning, because your meaning in the world is a product of your relationships with those individuals. Your purpose for your existence is wrapped up in your group. And so that was a terrible fate that they explored quite frequently in Old English poetry and in Old Norse, and the fate of the exile and the misery of that, and it becomes during Christian times even a sort of metaphor for the soul here in this existence, waiting to be reunited with something more spiritual, perhaps. So it's something that's very common, and it's something that I have an exile or two in my book. So yeah.
But one of the things I think that also maybe gave additional depth to you exploring that was you've spent time away from home.
Yeah.
You've spent time living away from the place that you grew up, your culture. That you moved out of that. You felt what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land.
Right. Right.
The different aspects of it, and that it's not all bad.
Well, in fact, it can be quite informative. So that is a big thing that I'm trying to explore in the book as well. The idea of discovering in the other oneself, the idea of transcending the tribe and seeing one's common humanity, seeing one's connection with those whom one might have thought to be other or foreign or different or even evil, and then realizing, oh, actually, they're very much like me, and in fact, I now feel a sense of not only connection but admiration for these people. So yeah, that is definitely something I'm exploring as well.
And it's through the use of no, I don't think it's giving the game away to say that you use multiple POVs. That
Yes, yes, yeah.
that's one
Third
of the
person narration, multiple POVs. Yeah.
um, with a certain level of focalization in each for
Yes.
each POV.
Yes.
Um, that with each of those, then I think you're exploring that the challenging the assumptions of perspective. Uh, Not, I think, as the major aspect and drive of what's going on, but it gives a level of verisimilitude to the perception of the secondary world that characters have base assumptions that they make. And because that's replicated in their points of view, but then challenged by other points of view, you actually get a feel for the world of these people. Yes, they do have biases. It's not just, oh, the author wanted them to go and say and do that thing. It doesn't feel forced or mechanical, though.
Right. Right.
But I'm curious as why you went for that sort of semi-omniscient third person POV style instead of, say, first person.
Yes. So I think you actually hit the nail on the head there in a way, and it does go back to what I was talking about in terms of that theme of discovering the self and the other, and discovering the uh, superficial difference in perspective is not something that you can't overcome and realize your commonality. So you were talking about focalization, meaning the character perspective sort of bleeds into the narrative, bleeds into the narration, I should say, where the third person narrator mirrors to some degree the prejudices, the biases, the tone of the POV character.
Yeah.
So I'll have a character who is from one part of the world and is looking at people from a different part of the world, and the narrator will echo that initial character's biases and prejudices to some degree. So yeah, and if you have that happening in one part of the book, but then you have the other perspective looking over here, then you're going to have some kind of a clash going on, then, aren't you? And how do you resolve that? And that's part of what the character is actually going through in that, not to give away too much here, but in the context of a holy war, you're going to have people encountering other parts of the world. And the assumption going in is going to be those people over there, they're evil, they're bad. But the reader already knows, oh, those people over there, they're not evil, they're not bad. So that's the key thing going on. That allows you that multiple POV thing allows you, I think, to introduce that theme in a way that's embedded in the narrative itself.
But it's interesting because you could have done that with a fully omniscient narrator. You could have chosen omniscient narration,
True.
third person. But I was obviously you can use the thing is I sometimes think that we put them in these categories and you go it's this box around it and it's only this one thing.
Right,
But
right.
how they are used can actually play around with what you do with third person omniscient. Um, you can deploy it in various different ways. But I think it is easier to give that individual point of view feeling to a text when you use that limited third person or semi limited, semi omniscient, focalized
Right.
point of view. That it can give it a different texture. But if you've chosen a fully omniscient third person POV, that it can feel very much of this is the story as it happened, and it's a recounting of events,
Hmm.
not something that you're sort of experiencing. I think there's something sometimes to that focalization that makes it feel more lived in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I do cheat a little bit once in a while. I actually do have an omniscient narrator once in a while, but for the most part, it's a limited omniscient narrator with
Well,
a certain amount of vocalization. Yeah.
because you can have an overt or a covert narrator, and
Right.
you can like the narrator could be fully omniscient, but choosing not to tell the story that way,
Right. Right.
and telling the story in a way that is mimicking a different style. But you then have those moments where it creeps in, and you get a sense of the almost the grander scale of it. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that third person omniscient does very well, is it gives it this sense of a grand story being told.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so there are strengths and weaknesses to the different approaches. Uh,
I agree. In terms of the style, it is modern prose, and I am not using actual medieval words or anything like that. I slip in some archaic words here and there, I think.
yeah, we
Right?
had a discussion about a couple of them that I went, you can't use that.
It's like, darn. But for the most part, I think it's fairly accessible. I don't think it's a difficult book to read. But I am clearly signaling that this is not our world. And
Yeah,
I always think of Ursula Le Guin's essay From Elfland to Poughkeepsie when I think of what I want to achieve in my fantasy and with my prose, which is to say, I want to create another world. I want my reader to feel immersed in this other place. I don't want my reader to feel like this could be New Jersey, right? So I want you to feel that this is a world that is different from ours, and that is partly achieved through this slightly archaic. And I do use not only a few archaic words here and there, but I'll do some inversion. I'll do some, I'll write sentences in a way that are clearly hearkening back to days
yeah.
of yore. Yeah. So
It generates the feeling of it feeling older, feeling more archaic, that it's almost like a formal old fashioned way to say something. And
right.
because of that, it translate that sense of time. Um,
Yes. Yes.
that's one of the effects. And you throw in the odd kenning here and there as well, don't
Oh,
you?
I love Kennings. Yeah. Yeah. I gotta have my Kennings. Yeah. So
Um, but and that's something that I think the language, you know, I think when people saw that prologue video where we were discussing the prologue, they said,
right.
yes, it is very much modern English in the modern style
Yeah.
of modern fantasy,
Yeah.
but there are elements that are harkening back to a more Tolkien-esque style of storytelling. Not,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to put anyone off to say, oh, it's like reading the Lord of the Rings. It's
Mm,
not as,
no,
it is more updated than that. It is
I would
much
say
more,
so. Yeah.
but it's not a very Spartan like transparent or beige prose.
Right.
That the style is slightly more evocative than that,
Right.
but very
Yeah.
much aware of the modern reader and the modern reader's tastes and likes.
Yeah, that was the goal. That was really the goal. Le Guin is another, I think, important influence for me. So I mentioned her essay, but also just her prose to me is it's lyrical and it's not overly complex though, but it just manages to do a lot with a little, I think. Very evocative. That is the word, I think. Yeah, so that's something I was trying for, at least in my writing. And again, I think it's important to help the reader feel immersed, to feel that this is this world I'm exploring right now, that I'm in, and to increase that sense of this as a world in and of itself, right? That is, it is not our world, but it is a world with its own history, its own mythology, its religions, its landscapes, right? So to fill all that in, I think.
The complex socio-political landscape and the different tribes and countries. Like, it's very, in a lot of respects, it's very well realized. Um, I was, it's one of the things I was actually very impressed by was the depth and complexity of a lot of the elements of the world. Um,
Yeah, I don't know how crazy this is or how common it is, but I did spend. I think I said many times that the first thing I did was I drew the map. The next thing I did was I spent quite a lot of time just writing the history and the mythology and the various religions and going into all of that for pages and pages, dozens and dozens of pages. I don't know exactly how many. I can't remember exactly how many pages of that I wrote, but I wrote maybe up to 100 pages of just, and that's nothing like Tolkien, obviously, who spent years and years writing this whole world. But it was important to me in order to give this place some depth, to have this history, and that maybe a lot of it never even comes up, in the story. But for me, it's there, and it gives it somehow, to me at least, this it makes it three-dimensional for me. So.
yeah, and it's well, no matter how detailed your notes are, there'll always be something you go, oh, I forgot to think about
Oh
that
yeah.
aspect.
Oh
There's
yeah.
always something you forget. But also, there are so many different ways that authors do this. That some authors go, no, I haven't considered any of that stuff. I randomly put in a couple of bits and pieces. If it ever comes up again, I'll invent it on the fly to fit with the
Right.
mention that was there.
Right.
Other authors like to have established, no, I wanted names for a couple of different places. I want a general sense of it. I want to make them distinct to that. So I'm creating these things. And they write down their notes. So
Yeah.
they engage in that. Erickson and Esselmont, obviously, like they gamed a lot of uh, their world, and it developed over time. Raymond D. Feist did that with his gaming group, that they had their homebrew campaign that all these different elements grew out of.
Yeah.
And then that became a resource to refer back to. But it's by no means you must do it this way. There are
No.
loads of ways to approach world building. But
Yeah.
obviously, this way worked for you.
It worked for me, and there are a lot of shortcuts that I use, for example, in terms of the languages. So when I have a character from one culture who is not fluent or doesn't know the language of other characters and is hearing those other characters speak in that foreign language, I will imitate. So I have various parts of my world. So one part is an imitation of maybe Old Norse. It's not Old Norse, but it's my imitation of Old Norse. Or I have an imitation of Welsh. If you have a character from the Old Norse culture, inspired culture, listening in to them, they're going to hear the sounds of Welsh, but it's not Welsh, right? So I've done that with the various languages in this world. I've sort of faked it by basing them on the sounds of these other languages that I know. So that's kind of I guess a shortcut of a sort. But
Yeah, and it helps you wrap your head around it because I think sometimes it's difficult for us as readers when we get the finished product. We're looking at this thing, go, wow, this world is so amazing and it really feels lived at you. How did they ever do that? You go, this is one of the ways how. This is one of
yeah,
the ways that it creates that feeling of authenticity and depth
yeah,
is thinking of elements from our world and bringing them in, but not on a one-to-one of, oh yeah, I'm just going to have them speak French. It's,
right. I mean, you could do that, but that's not what I've done exactly. So yeah,
So but it was interesting to me that some of the well, you obviously used Welsh, but for me, like I saw a lot of it as a general Celtic influence.
Yes, that's true. Some of the names I stole from Irish, for sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
and there was certainly a very distinct contrast between the sort of the Anglo-Saxon and
Right.
the Celtic influences that you could see
Yeah.
them sitting there side by side. But it was only through some recent stuff. I think it was like the TV show Vikings and various things like that that I learned more about the Viking settlements in England and the
Yeah.
that whole period of history. That oh, there was a whole series of books, and I remember reading stuff when I was younger. But that's what leapt into my mind recently about it when I was thinking of when I was reading your work. That it was reminiscent of those Danish settlements in
Sure.
what is now become England.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's a part of my little world that I've created, a continent essentially on that world, where you have a culture that is Old Norse inspired, that lives side by side with a culture that is Old English inspired. And there's a similar kind of interaction going on between them, and a sort of a lack of awareness of their common ancestry. So I think it's fair to say that by the time the Vikings were invading England, most of the English had forgotten that they had done the same thing to the previous occupants of that island, right? So that kind of little historical irony is something that I've tried to include
Or
in there too.
or when the Normans invaded England, and you go, and where were the Normans from? Well,
Oh,
that was it. A lot of that had to do with the Vikings who settled in that part of France.
in Normandy, the place of the Northmen. Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and mixed in there too. Also, I have South Asian, very strong South Asian influence. So that's all going on in there too. All of that mixing. But yeah, they're clearly fictional. Everything in there is fictional. They're fictional cultures, fictional religions. But a lot of the inspiration comes from our own world and from history. And I think that's a fairly common technique in fantasy, to engage in the real world in order to create a secondary world that is convincing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's even like asking the question, what if? What if, say the Vikings had invaded China, and
Yeah.
working out ramifications of that? How would that have affected the culture of that region? And
Yeah.
then think about that, playing with it, and go, that might make a really interesting sort of setting then for a fantasy. So taking that then that you've created, using elements of these things and running it through an extrapolative sort of filter,
Yeah.
you end up with something that might be a little bit different, that might give you an edge. And then as you're writing, obviously you shape it further because
Right.
you start with a concept. And as you write and things get fleshed out, or you go, that kind of doesn't work now, or I need to do something here to streamline it, or to
Yeah.
build on it because this was really interesting. How can I build and develop it further? That
Yeah.
through the process of writing, you do alter it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. You never know where the story is going to take you. Yeah. But this has been a very fun conversation, my friend. And I mean, I love talking about world building. It's something that I kind of live and breathe. It's part of the fun of writing for me, was just creating this world, and being able to tweak it and see what the story could reveal to me about it. And so it's I love landscapes. I love history and mythology, and all of this is sort of, I hope anyway, something that will be obvious to my readers, that these are all important parts of the experience, I guess, of this story. So I hope it's enriching for the reader. That's my goal anyway. So
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on, Philip. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to seeing people respond to your book because I greatly enjoyed it.
yeah, thank you, my friend. And everybody, thank you for watching this, and go and check out AP's channel if you don't know it. Most of you probably do at this point, but he's over there at A Critical Dragon. All right, till next time.